chosen. 1. There is a reason your life went quiet, and it has nothing to do with rejection, failure, or being forgotten. There is a reason the calls stopped, a reason the messages slowed, and a reason people disappeared without explanation. This was not abandonment, this was containment. When your life began to shift, when your spirit matured beyond emotional reactions, something unseen intervened. Because when the enemy realizes he can no longer destroy you through chaos, confusion, or heartbreak, his final option is not more noise, it is silence. Isolation is not always a curse. Sometimes it is a shield. You didn't lose people, you outgrew access. Certain connections were never meant to follow you into the next version of yourself, because familiarity can become contamination when your discernment sharpens. And the most dangerous moment for darkness is when a chosen one stops bleeding emotionally and starts observing spiritually. That moment, when you no longer react, no longer chase explanations, no longer beg for clarity, when you simply see. Some of you have asked, why do I feel lonely when I did nothing wrong? Why do I feel unseen, even though I've been faithful? Hear this clearly. Loneliness is not always punishment. Sometimes it is divine quarantine. There is a phase where heaven steps back, not to abandon you, but to test the integrity of your spirit when applause disappears, to see who still has access to your soul when there is no audience, no validation, and no reinforcement. Silence reveals loyalty. Quiet exposes motive. And in that stillness, your spiritual senses awaken. You begin to notice patterns you once ignored. You recognize who drained you and who never poured back. You realize some people were only comfortable with the version of you that was wounded, doubting, or seeking approval. And when healing arrived, so did distance. This is not loss. This is alignment. The enemy studied you closely. He saw that every betrayal refined you, every delay strengthened you, and every lonely night trained you to hear beyond emotion. Every attack sharpened your discernment instead of breaking your spirit. And when he realized that pain no longer distracted you, that confusion no longer weakened you, and that isolation no longer made you desperate, he did the unthinkable. He backed away. Not because he became merciful, not because the battle ended, but because you became untouchable at that level. Your peace disrupted his strategy. Your stillness disrupted his access. You're not being hidden because you're insignificant. You're being hidden because you're being prepared. This quiet season is recalibrating your vision, purifying your motives, and sealing your spirit. Before we go deeper, comment, "I am chosen," like this video, and subscribe, because this message only activates for those who are meant to hear it. Now, let's dive deeper. Point 1. The loneliness was not accidental. Chosen one, the loneliness you feel did not arrive randomly, and it did not arrive to punish you. It arrived because your environment could no longer support the weight of who you were becoming. There is a moment in every chosen one's journey where familiarity becomes dangerous. Not because people are evil, but because access becomes misused. You began to notice that conversations drained you instead of strengthening you. You noticed that explaining yourself felt heavier than remaining silent. You noticed that after certain interactions, your spirit felt dull instead of clear. That was not social anxiety. That was discernment activating. Loneliness is not always the absence of love. Sometimes it is the absence of interference. God does not isolate to weaken. He isolates to stabilize. The same way a surgeon clears a room before operating, your life had to be cleared before precision could occur. The silence you entered was not empty. It was calibrated. In that silence, emotional dependencies were removed, external validation was withdrawn, and for the first time you were forced to sit with yourself without mirrors, without applause, and without opposition. This is where identity solidifies. This is where you stop performing and start being. Many people never survive this phase because they mistake stillness for abandonment. But you remained, and because you remained, you advanced. Point 2. When the enemy realized you could not be broken. Chosen one, understand this clearly. The enemy does not retreat when you suffer. Pain alone never scares opposition. What causes retreat is adaptation. You were allowed to walk through disappointment, betrayal, misunderstanding, and delayed justice not to break you, but to train you. Many collapse when they realize fairness is not immediate and loyalty is rare. You didn't. You felt the sting, but you did not let it harden your heart. You refused bitterness. You refused revenge. You refused to abandon your moral center just to feel momentarily powerful. Instead, you did something far more dangerous to your enemies. You learned. You began observing patterns instead of reacting to moments. You started noticing who benefited from your confusion, who fed off your explanations, and who smiled when you were emotionally exposed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you adjusted. This is the exact moment the strategy shifted against you. When emotional reactions stopped being accessible, manipulation lost its leverage. When provocation no longer produced visible chaos, it stopped being useful. You stopped oversharing details of your inner world. You stopped reacting publicly to private wounds. You stopped explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand, only to collect data. And that silence was not weakness, it was recalibration. Every attempt to destabilize you began to sharpen your perception instead. You noticed timing. You noticed inconsistencies. You noticed motives beneath words. You became quieter, not because you were afraid, but because you no longer needed noise to validate your existence. You became slower, not because you were unsure, but because precision replaced impulse. You became less emotional, not because you were cold, but because grounding replaced volatility. At that stage, continued attacks would only expose the entire system working against you, and exposure is dangerous for those who thrive in shadows. So distance became the safer option. Silence became the new tactic. And here is where many chosen ones misinterpret the moment. You thought the quiet meant abandonment. You thought the absence meant you were forgotten. You thought the stillness was loneliness. In reality, it was evidence of caution, not admiration-based respect, but strategic respect. You became someone whose reactions were no longer predictable, whose emotional buttons no longer worked, and whose presence carried consequence. You became expensive to provoke, and when provoking you costs more than it benefits them, retreat is inevitable. Point 3. Why you were declared untouchable. There is a truth most people are never told, and it is this: some battles are not stopped because the enemy suddenly grows a conscience, but because the cost of continuing becomes too high to hide. Chosen one, your collapse would have created too much noise. Your breaking point would not have ended quietly. Too many eyes would have turned. Too many questions would have been asked. Too many invisible systems would have been forced into the light. Your suffering would have traced lines back to their source, exposing patterns that were meant to remain concealed. So the strategy changed. Instead of escalation, containment was chosen. Instead of open attack, withdrawal. This is why certain doors closed without chaos. This is why certain people disappeared from your path rather than confronting you directly. This is why attempts to discredit you never fully take shape. Words are spoken, but they do not stick. Narratives are formed, but they collapse under their own weight. Plans are made, but they dissolve before execution. You may have mistaken this for coincidence or luck, but it is neither. You are not being spared because you are fragile. You are being spared because touching you now would trigger exposure that cannot be controlled. When darkness cannot win quietly, it does not charge recklessly, it retreats strategically. And in that retreat, space is created, space for you to stabilize, space for you to mature, space for your awareness to sharpen without constant interference. This is not indulgence, this is not favoritism, this is a function. Certain vessels carry too much implication to be publicly damaged. Certain lives, when harmed, leave evidence. Certain souls, when pushed too far, cause entire structures to shake. You are one of those vessels. Your endurance has already rewritten outcomes behind the scenes. Your continued presence unsettles systems that rely on silence and confusion. That is why pressure was reduced rather than increased. That is why resistance softened instead of intensified. You were not removed from the battlefield because you were losing. You were removed because your continued struggle would have revealed who placed you there in the first place. This phase is not about attack or defense. It is about consolidation, about alignment, about becoming so internally coherent that any future attempt to disturb you would immediately expose the hand behind it. What you're experiencing now is not absence of conflict. It is proof that conflict has become too dangerous for your opposition to continue openly. Point 4. Isolation as divine protection. Isolation feels cruel when misunderstood, but isolation is one of the highest forms of protection, and this truth only reveals itself when you stop judging the season by how it feels and start discerning it by what it prevents. Rejection wounds the ego because the ego craves witnesses, validation, applause, and proof that you are becoming something recognizable. But isolation preserves the spirit because the spirit grows best away from noise, comparison, and premature consumption. During this phase, you were not abandoned, you were removed. You were quietly taken out of environments that would have misinterpreted your growth, questioned your pace, doubted your silence, or tried to define you before you had fully defined yourself. You were separated from people who would have rushed your process because their comfort depended on your availability, who would have leaned on your emerging strength without respecting the pain that forged it, and who would have attached themselves to your future while minimizing the cost of your past. This season was not about loneliness. It was about preservation. You were protected from premature exposure, from being seen before you were ready to be seen, from explaining a vision that was still forming, and from defending a calling that required no committee approval. You were protected from emotional theft, from those who take energy but never replenish it, who feed on access rather than alignment. You were protected from carrying others while still healing yourself, because carrying weight before your foundation is reinforced only leads to collapse. Isolation does not mean you are unloved. It means you are being handled carefully. Just as fragile things are wrapped, stored, and set apart, so are souls undergoing refinement. God isolates what must not be contaminated. He separates what is sensitive from what is careless. He covers what is not yet complete, not out of punishment, but out of precision. There are stages of growth that cannot survive constant observation, stages of becoming that require silence, solitude, and distance from familiar voices. You were not meant to be understood in this season, because understanding invites interference. You were meant to be prepared, shaped in private, strengthened without distraction, and rooted without applause. One day the isolation will lift, and when it does, you will realize nothing was taken from you. What was removed was what could not come with you. What felt like emptiness was actually space. What felt like loss was alignment. And what felt like abandonment was divine restraint, ensuring that when you finally emerge, you do so whole, clear, and uncontaminated. Point 5. Why you no longer fit anywhere. Chosen. 1. The discomfort you feel in old environments is not arrogance, and it is not rebellion. It is incompatibility at a spiritual level. You are no longer designed to blend into spaces that demand you shrink, perform, or dilute your truth just to be accepted. Something fundamental has shifted within you. Your awareness has sharpened. You see too clearly now. You hear undertones beneath polite conversations. You sense intentions before words are spoken. You recognize manipulation before it fully forms, and because of this, shallow spaces have become unbearable. Not because you believe you are better than others, but because you are no longer unconscious. You are awake in rooms that survive on sleep. You don't fit because fitting would require regression, and regression is no longer permitted for you. Your nervous system rejects what once felt normal. Your spirit resists environments that thrive on pretense, small talk, and hidden agendas. This rejection can feel isolating at first, but understand this clearly. It is not loneliness. It is realignment. You are being pulled out of familiar patterns, so you can no longer be controlled by them. What once entertained you now drains you. What once felt safe now feels constricting. This is the cost of clarity. When your inner vision expands, old containers can no longer hold you. People may interpret your withdrawal as pride or distance, but they do not see the internal recalibration happening within you. You are no longer willing to trade authenticity for belonging. You are no longer willing to betray your intuition for comfort. This tension you feel, the awkwardness, the silence, the sense of standing apart, is the birthplace of leadership. True leadership is not forged in crowds. It is forged in moments of separation where you learn to stand without validation. You are being trained to trust your inner compass more than external approval. This phase teaches you discernment, emotional sovereignty, and spiritual authority. You are learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to engage and when to withdraw. What feels like exile is actually preparation. You are being repositioned into environments, callings, and connections that match your frequency. Until then, the discomfort remains, not as punishment, but as guidance. Your spirit is saying, you have outgrown this, and once that message is heard, there is no going back. Point 6. The psychological shift. No one notices. There is a quiet change that happened inside you, and it did not announce itself with noise or drama. It arrived without witnesses, without applause, and without the need to be validated. You stopped needing to be seen, not because you became invisible, but because you finally became solid within yourself. You stopped needing to be understood because you realized that clarity does not come from explaining yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped needing agreement to remain steady because your inner compass no longer spins based on external opinions. This is the mark of internal authority, the moment when your sense of self stops being outsourced. When approval is no longer your fuel, manipulation loses its grip, because manipulation feeds on hunger, on insecurity, and on the need to be affirmed. You became self-contained, no longer leaking energy through over-explaining, over-giving, or over-reacting. You became emotionally regulated, not numb, not detached, but stable, able to feel without being ruled by feeling. You became spiritually anchored, rooted in something deeper than circumstances, something that does not fluctuate with praise or criticism. This is why chaos avoids you now. Chaos feeds on reaction, on impulsive emotion, on fractured attention. You respond with stillness, and stillness starves chaos of its power. You no longer chase clarity through noise, arguments, or endless analysis. You wait for alignment, because alignment arrives quietly and leaves no confusion behind. This psychological grounding makes you unmanageable to systems built on confusion, because confusion requires you to doubt yourself, and you no longer do. You see patterns without panic, intentions without paranoia, and truth without the need to convince anyone else of it. Your silence is no longer emptiness, it is containment. Your calm is not weakness, it is mastery. You move slower, but with precision. You speak less, but with weight. And because you're no longer predictable through emotion, no longer reactive through insecurity, and no longer dependent on validation, you have become difficult to control. Not aggressive, not rebellious, simply sovereign. This is the quiet power that unsettles unstable structures. This is why doors open without force, why resistance dissolves without confrontation, and why those who rely on chaos feel uneasy in your presence. You did not harden, you integrated. You did not withdraw, you stabilized, and in doing so, you stepped into a level of authority that does not demand attention, but commands respect simply by existing. Point 7. What comes after the silence? Chosen one. This season will not remain hidden forever. Silence is not the destination. It is the forge. When you re-enter visibility, you will not announce yourself. Your presence will speak. People will feel corrected without being confronted. You will move without urgency, speak without defensiveness, and decide without fear. Those who left will feel the distance, not because you pushed them away, but because you no longer chase familiarity. You are not returning to prove anything. You are returning to occupy space. This is the phase where authority replaces effort, influence replaces explanation, and alignment replaces loneliness. You were never abandoned. You were being secured. Remain steady. Remain observant. Remain grounded. You are not alone. You are positioned.